It was a case that got national attention. This 15-year-old shot and killed in Marion County.
My understanding what happened was she called to break up with him because he was abusive.
Today we learned that while in prison for the murder of Seth Jackson, Michael Bargo has faced 5 disciplinary actions.
At just 18 years old, Michael Bargo planned and carried out one of the most brutal and premeditated murders in Florida's history. A crime so calculated that it left even hardened criminals shocked and made him the youngest person in the state to be sentenced to death at the time. How does someone so young conceive and execute a crime of such unimaginable cruelty? Early life. Michael Shane Bargo, famously known as Detroit Youngest, had a childhood that set the stage for his troubled life. He was born on April 29, 1992, in Florida, to Tracy O'Brien and Michael Bargo Sr. If you're wondering why he was referred to as Detroit Youngest, it was actually due to his upbringing in Detroit, Michigan. In letters written from jail, Bargo mentioned moving to Detroit at the age of 5, where he spent part of his childhood, which played a significant role in shaping his experiences and persona, including the nickname Detroit Youngest. He described being picked on in school for his small stature and being surrounded by gang life. These experiences led him to adopt a tough persona from a young age. He eventually returned to Florida before the events that led to the murder of Seth Jackson. Michael's childhood was equally chaotic, growing up alongside his younger sister Lauren, whom he was 7 years his junior. His parents' relationship was a total wreck, full of frequent arguments and fights, the sort of instability that left a lasting impact on Michael's emotional well-being. From an early age, Michael showed signs of isolation and rebellion. Teachers at Bellevue High School, where he briefly attended, noted that he had difficulty fitting in and often kept to himself. His struggles in the classroom were evident, with reports suggesting he had trouble focusing and following through with assignments. Some believed he may have had undiagnosed learning disabilities, but no official diagnosis was ever pursued because no one close to him cared to find out. Michael's relationship with his father, Michael Sr., was particularly full of tension. His mother, Tracy, testified during court proceedings that the two often clashed, leading to heated confrontations. The volatile home environment resulted in Michael spending more time outside the house, seeking refuge with friends who were also navigating their own troubled lives. Witness accounts from those close to the family suggest that financial instability also played a role in the household tension. With limited resources and constant inadequate finances, Michael's parents struggled to provide the structure and stability he needed during his formative years. Despite his challenges at home, Michael initially tried to find his footing in school. However, by middle school, his attendance became irregular and his behavior turned increasingly aggressive. He was frequently involved in fights and exhibited defiant behavior toward authority figures. School records indicate that disciplinary actions were taken against him multiple times, but efforts to reform his behavior proved unsuccessful. During his teenage years, Michael formed close ties with individuals who would later play pivotal roles in his life, including Amber Wright, Kyle Hooper, Charlie Ely, and Justin Soto. They shared similar backgrounds of broken homes and delinquent behavior, and their influence on Michael only deepened his descent into trouble. Michael's friendship with Amber Wright, in particular, was complex and tumultuous. The two shared an on-again, off-again relationship filled with jealousy and emotional volatility. According to close sources, Amber's rejection of Michael played a significant role in shaping his resentment and anger, which only grew darker and darker over time. By the age of 16, Michael had several run-ins with the law. He had been arrested for petty theft and vandalism, incidents that his family saw as minor infractions, but were clear warning signs of a deeper issue. His interactions with law enforcement painted a picture of a young man grappling with anger and a desire for control, traits that would later manifest in more violent ways. But there are some reports which indicate that Michael's parents attempted to intervene by seeking counseling and setting stricter boundaries, but their efforts were often met with resistance. His mother, Tracy, later testified that he had difficulty managing his emotions and often experienced intense mood swings. Experts believe that Michael may have suffered from untreated mental health conditions, such as oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, or intermittent explosive disorder, IED, which could explain his frequent outbursts and inability to control his impulses. Michael's struggles extended to substance abuse. By his late teens, he had experimented with hard substances, including marijuana and prescription pills, Those around him recalled that he used substances to escape from his troubled reality, further alienating himself from his family. One of the most defining moments in Michael's life was the separation of his parents. The divorce, which occurred when he was 15, deeply affected him. He felt abandoned and lost, seeking solace and comfort in the streets and his friends. His mother later admitted that the family breakdown likely fueled Michael's sense of resentment and rejection. Another turning point came when Michael dropped out of school and began staying with friends for long periods, avoiding contact with his family. He drifted from place to place, often getting involved in risky activities. Friends who spent time with him during this period recalled that he had an unpredictable temper and was prone to violent outbursts when provoked. In one incident, a close friend alleged that Michael had once smashed a car window in a fit of rage over something so trivial, which was clear red flags, but everyone around him ignored it. Incidents like these became more frequent as he struggled to control his emotions. Despite his troubled background, Michael at times expressed a desire to turn his life around. Friends recalled conversations where he spoke about wanting to pursue a career in music or mechanics. However, his lack of discipline and support system made it difficult for him to follow through with any positive aspirations. He spent much of his time aimlessly wandering the streets, frequently getting into arguments and altercations that only deepened his reputation as a troubled young man. The crimes. On April 17, 2011, the small town of Summerfield, Florida, became the epicenter of a horrific crime that would gain national attention. At the heart of it was Michael Shane Bargo, an 18-year-old who, along with his accomplices, orchestrated the brutal murder of 15-year-old Seth Jackson. This crime was not a random act of violence, but a calculated, cold-blooded plan fueled by jealousy, revenge, and a web of complex relationships. Seth Jackson was no stranger to the individuals who would later take his life. He had previously dated Amber Wright, one of Michael Bargo's close associates, and their breakup was anything but amicable. According to a close source, Amber and Seth's relationship had been so toxic, with accusations of infidelity and abuse. When Amber moved on and began seeing Michael, tensions escalated. Michael's obsession with Amber quickly turned into a dangerous fixation on Seth. Witnesses claimed that Michael harbored deep resentment, believing Seth had mistreated Amber and humiliated him. This festering anger led to what prosecutors later described as a meticulously planned act of revenge. Michael, aided by his friends, devised a plot to lure Seth to a mobile home under the guise of reconciliation with Amber. On the night of the murder, Amber Wright and Charlie Ely, a friend, contacted Seth and persuaded him to come over, believing he was going to mend things with Amber. Seth arrived at the mobile home located at 1839-66 Southeast 53rd Avenue. Unbeknownst to him, Michael Bargo, along with Kyle Hooper, Justin Soto, and Charlie Ely, lay in wait. As Seth entered the home, he was ambushed. Kyle Hooper struck him first, knocking him down. What followed was a ruthless attack. Bargo shot Seth multiple times with a .22 caliber gun. Prosecutors argued that Bargo's actions were calculated with the intent to ensure Seth suffered a slow and painful death. After the initial attack, Seth attempted to escape, but Bargo pursued him, firing more shots. When Seth collapsed, he was dragged into the bathroom, where Bargo allegedly continued to taunt him as he bled out. Realizing Seth was still alive, Bargo shot him once more in the face. With Seth now deceased, the group quickly shifted their focus to disposing of his body. Under Michael's orders, they stuffed Seth's body into a sleeping bag and carried him outside. They then placed his remains into a backyard fire pit and burned his body in an attempt to destroy evidence. Witnesses later testified that Bargo watched the fire burn with a disturbing sense of satisfaction, showing no remorse for his actions. The next day, the group collected the charred remains and disposed of them in a rock quarry nearby, hoping to erase any trace of the crime. However, their efforts to conceal their actions would soon unravel. Seth Jackson's disappearance did not go unnoticed. His mother, Sonia Jackson, reported him missing when he failed to return home that evening. Authorities quickly launched an investigation, tracing Seth's last known movements to Amber Wright and her circle of friends. As detectives began questioning those involved, inconsistencies in their stories emerged. The breakthrough came when Kyle Hooper's mother overheard her son discussing the murder and reported it to law enforcement. This critical tip led investigators to the mobile home, where they uncovered key pieces of evidence, including bloodstains and bullet casings. Under pressure, Kyle Hooper and Justin Soto eventually confessed, detailing the gruesome events of that night and implicating Michael Bargo as the mastermind behind the killing. Bargo, sensing the walls closing in, attempted to flee to Starkey, Florida, where he was eventually apprehended by U.S. Marshals. Upon his arrest, authorities found incriminating text messages on his phone that discussed the murder and his intent to evade law enforcement. The prosecution built a compelling case against Bargo, relying on forensic evidence and witness testimonies. Blood samples found in the bathroom matched Seth Jackson's DNA, and the discovery of the murder weapon further solidified the case. Text messages between Bargo and Amber Wright also pointed to premeditation, with prosecutors arguing that the couple had carefully plotted Seth's demise in the weeks leading up to the murder. Additionally, phone records placed Bargo at the scene of the crime, contradicting his claims of innocence. As details of the murder came to light, the media seized on the brutal nature of the crime. News outlets across the country covered the story, painting Bargo as a remorseless killer who manipulated his friends into carrying out his twisted vendetta. Social media platforms exploded with discussions about the case, with many expressing shock and anger over the senselessness of the crime. Hashtags like #Justice for Seth began trending, with thousands calling for the maximum punishment for Bargo and his accomplices. Community members in Summerfield were deeply affected, with many attending candlelight vigils to honor Seth Jackson's memory. His family spoke out publicly, demanding justice for their beloved son and condemning the individuals responsible for his death. While Michael Bargo was identified as the ringleader, his accomplices did not escape legal repercussions. Amber Wright, Kyle Hooper, and Justin Soto were all charged with first-degree murder, while Charlie Ely faced charges of accessory to murder. Prosecutors argued that although Bargo fired the fatal shots, the others played crucial roles in the crime's planning and execution. Each defendant faced separate trials, with some opting to testify against Bargo in exchange for plea deals. During sentencing hearings, prosecutors pushed for the harshest penalties, emphasizing the brutality of the murder and the lack of remorse shown by those involved. The trial. Although Bargo was arrested in April 2011, it wasn't until over 2 years later, on the 19th of August 2013, that his trial began. And from the very first day, it became apparent that both sides were preparing for a fierce legal battle. Prosecutors, led by State Attorney Brad King, presented their case methodically, using forensic evidence, testimonies, and horrifying details of the crime scene to paint Bargo as a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution's star witnesses included Kyle Hooper and Justin Soto, Bargo's former friends who took plea deals in exchange for their testimony. They recounted the events of that fateful night in gruesome detail, describing how Bargo pulled the trigger and later boasted about burning Seth Jackson's body. Hooper, visibly emotional on the stand, revealed that Bargo had a deep hatred for Seth and spoke about wanting him dead long before the crime took place. Forensic experts provided compelling evidence, including DNA samples found at the scene and text messages exchanged between Bargo and Amber Wright, which prosecutors argued demonstrated premeditation. Cell phone records placed Bargo at the mobile home during the time of the murder, while ballistic experts confirmed that the .22 caliber gun used in the crime was linked directly to him. One of the most shocking moments in the trial came when Sonia Jackson, Seth's mother, took the stand. Holding back tears, she spoke about the devastating impact of her son's murder and pleaded for justice. Her emotional testimony left a lasting impression on the jury in the courtroom, many of whom were visibly moved by her words. In contrast, Bargo's defense team, led by attorney Charles Holloman, focused on portraying him as a troubled young man with a history of mental illness. They argued that he suffered from bipolar disorder and severe emotional trauma, which impaired his ability to make rational decisions. The defense presented medical records and expert testimonies suggesting that Michael struggled with impulse control issues and often exhibited erratic behavior. A psychologist hired by the defense testified that Bargo showed signs of emotional instability and a troubled upbringing that may have influenced his actions. They argued that his past, coupled with the influence of his peers, played a significant role in the events that unfolded. After weeks of testimonies and evidence presentation, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The room fell silent as the judge read the decision, and Michael Bargo showed little emotion as the reality of his fate set in. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, citing the brutality of the crime and Bargo's apparent lack of remorse. The defense, however, pleaded for a life sentence, arguing that Michael's age and mental health should be taken into consideration. The jury ultimately voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty, and Judge David Eddy sentenced Bargo to death row, making him the youngest person in Florida at the time to receive such a sentence. Bargo's defense team quickly filed appeals, arguing that the jury's non-unanimous decision violated his constitutional rights. In 2016, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that all death sentences required a unanimous jury recommendation. This decision granted Bargo a resentencing trial, which began in April 2019, giving him a second chance to avoid execution. The resentencing trial saw a similar set of arguments, with the defense once again emphasizing Michael's troubled background and mental health issues. His parents, Tracy O'Brien and Michael Bargo Sr., testified about his difficult upbringing, citing their divorce and financial struggles as contributing factors to his mental state. However, the prosecution remained steadfast, highlighting Bargo's disciplinary record while in prison. It was revealed that Michael had been involved in multiple incidents behind bars, including assaults on other inmates and possession of contraband. This painted him as an ongoing threat to society, strengthening the case for the death penalty. In September 2019, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, once again recommending death by lethal injection. The judge reaffirmed Bargo's sentence, sealing his fate once and for all. In the aftermath of the trial, Seth Jackson's family sought to move forward, establishing community outreach programs to help at-risk youth avoid the same fate as their son. Local schools implemented anti-bullying and conflict resolution programs in honor of Seth's memory. Meanwhile, Michael Bargo's name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked anger and the consequences of falling into the wrong crowd. The case served as a grim warning to many young people in the community about the life-altering impact of poor choices. Despite multiple appeals and requests for clemency, Michael Bargo's legal options dwindled. His attorneys continued to fight, arguing for a sentence commutation based on his mental state and age at the time of the crime. However, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision, and in 2021, Michael remained on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. Life on death row. Since his initial death sentence in 2013, Michael Shane Bargo Jr. has navigated a complex and difficult journey through the legal system, all while confined to Florida's death row. His time behind bars has been marked by legal battles, personal reflections, and the ever-looming possibility of execution. Following his conviction, a jury recommended the death penalty with a 10-2 vote, leading to his initial death sentence. However, changes in Florida's death penalty laws, which now require a unanimous jury recommendation for such sentences, prompted a resentencing. In April 2019, a new jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and in September 2019, Circuit Judge Anthony Taddy reaffirmed Bargo's death sentence. Bargo, then 27, became the youngest inmate on Florida's death row. Incarcerated at Union Correctional Institution, Bargo's daily life is characterized by isolation and strict routines. Death row inmates in Florida are typically housed in solitary cells, measuring approximately 6 by 9 feet for up to 23 hours a day. They are allowed limited personal possessions and have minimal interaction with other inmates. Reports indicate that Bargo has faced disciplinary actions during his incarceration, including incidents of violent outbursts and possession of contraband. These infractions have contributed to his complex profile within the prison system. Throughout his time on death row, Bargo has undergone various mental health evaluations. His defense has presented evidence of mental health issues, including bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder, in attempts to mitigate his sentence. However, these arguments have not swayed the court's decisions. Bargo has maintained his innocence, often expressing frustration with the legal system. In a 2019 court appearance, he described the sentencing hearing as a big circus and claimed he had evidence to prove his innocence that was not considered. As of January 2025, Michael Bargo remains on death row, with no execution date scheduled. The uncertainty of his fate looms large as legal processes and potential appeals continue to unfold. The possibility of execution hangs over him daily and will continue to do so for the rest of his life. They were just kids, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, but they were sentenced to die. From the youngest female ever sentenced to death to the teen who claimed demonic possession made him kill, their stories are haunting. Some were executed before they even had a chance to fight, while others lived just long enough to see the laws changed to save them. These are the 15 youngest inmates ever sentenced to death in U.S. history. Paula Cooper. Paula Cooper was just 15 years old when she was sentenced to death in Indiana, making her the youngest female death row inmate in U.S. history. Her case sparked global outrage, leading to a push for juvenile sentencing reform that ultimately saved her life. Born in 1970, Cooper had a violent and unstable childhood, suffering physical and sexual abuse at the hands of family members. By her early teens, she had dropped out of school and was involved in gang activity. But on May 14, 1985, she took part in a crime that would change her life forever. That day, Cooper and 3 other teenage girls decided to rob and kill Ruth Pelkey, a 77-year-old Bible teacher in Gary, Indiana. The attack was brutal. Pelkey was stabbed 33 times with a butcher knife, and the girls stole $10 and her car before fleeing. Cooper later confessed, saying she committed the crime for fun. At trial, the jury wasted no time convicting her, and in 1986, at just 16 years old, Cooper was sentenced to death. The ruling shocked the world, triggering an international campaign to save her life. Even Pope John Paul II publicly pleaded for clemency, arguing that a child should not be executed. The pressure worked. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court commuted her death sentence to 60 years in prison, citing her young age and history of abuse. Over time, Cooper transformed herself in prison, earning a college degree and becoming a model inmate. She was granted parole in 2013 after serving 27 years behind bars. Tragically, just 2 years after her release, Cooper died by suicide in 2015. Anthony Porter. Anthony Porter came within 48 hours of execution for a crime he didn't commit. Wrongfully convicted of a 1982 double murder in Chicago, Illinois, Porter spent 16 years on death row before a group of journalism students uncovered the truth that set him free. His case became one of the most shocking wrongful convictions in U.S. history and played a key role in Illinois abolishing the death penalty in 2011. Porter was 17 years old when he was arrested for the murders of Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard, who were shot at a public swimming pool in Chicago. The case against him rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, but no physical evidence linked him to the crime. Despite his claims of innocence, a jury convicted him in 1983, and he was sentenced to death. Over the years, Porter exhausted his appeals, and by 1998, he was scheduled for execution. But just 2 days before he was set to die, his case was picked up by Northwestern University journalism professor David Protess and his students, who began re-examining the evidence. What they found was shocking. The eyewitness who had testified against Porter recanted his statement, admitting he had been pressured by police. The students then tracked down the real killer, All-Story Simon, who confessed on video to committing the murders. With this new evidence, Porter was exonerated and released in 1999 after spending 16 years on death row for a crime he never committed. His case became a turning point in the fight against wrongful convictions, exposing deep flaws in the criminal justice system. It played a major role in Illinois, placing a moratorium on executions in 2000 and ultimately abolishing the death penalty in 2011. Sean Sellers. Sean Sellers was just 16 years old when he committed a series of brutal murders that would ultimately land him on Oklahoma's death row. Born in 1969, Sellers had a troubled upbringing, often describing feelings of alienation and anger. He became deeply fascinated with Satanism and the occult, a fixation that would later become central to his defense. In 1985, Sellers murdered convenience store clerk Robert Bauer in cold blood. He claimed he killed Bauer simply because the man had refused to sell him beer, but that was only the beginning. Months later, in 1986, he executed both his mother, Vonda Bell Sellers, and his stepfather, Paul Bell, while they slept. Sellers would later claim that he was under the influence of a demonic entity at the time of the killings. During his trial, the prosecution painted him as a remorseless killer, dismissing his claims of demonic possession and mental illness. His defense team argued that Sellers suffered from dissociative identity disorder, DID, meaning he was not fully aware of his actions. But in 1986, he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. On death row, Sellers underwent a transformation, converting to Christianity and renouncing Satanism. He even wrote letters warning others about the dangers of the occult. His case sparked national debate, with activists and religious leaders, including the Pope, pleading for clemency, citing his young age and possible mental illness. However, their efforts failed. On February 4, 1999, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection at age 29. Napoleon Beasley. Napoleon Beasley was just 17 years old when he murdered John Luddig, a prominent Texas businessman, during a botched carjacking in 1994. Born in Beaumont, Texas, Beasley was a standout student and athlete with no prior criminal record. But one fateful night, he and 2 accomplices set out to steal a car, choosing Luddig's Mercedes-Benz as their target. As Luddig pulled into his driveway, Beasley approached and shot him in the head at close range. His accomplices later testified that Beasley fired the fatal shot. The crime was made even more high-profile because Luddig was the father of federal judge J. Michael Luddig, a man with deep political connections. At trial, prosecutors wasted no time securing a death sentence, arguing that Beasley showed no remorse. His defense team pointed out that Beasley was just a teenager and had no history of violence, but the Texas jury handed down the ultimate punishment. His case took another turn, with critics arguing that Beasley's race played a role in his sentencing. He was black, his victim was white, and Texas had a long history of racial bias in capital punishment cases. Even Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor later expressed doubts about his execution. Despite national and international pressure to halt the execution, including appeals from former President Jimmy Carter and Nobel laureates, Beasley's sentence was upheld. On May 28, 2002, at the age of 25, Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. James Terry Roach. James Terry Roach was 17 years old when he took part in a brutal double murder in South Carolina. Unlike others on this list, his age did not save him. He was executed in 1986, despite international protests calling for mercy. Born in 1967, Roach had intellectual disabilities and a low IQ, which some experts said left him vulnerable to manipulation. But that didn't stop him from getting involved in a violent crime that would lead to his execution. On November 26, 1977, Roach and 2 older accomplices, Joseph Carl Shaw and Raymond Hamilton, carried out a crime spree in Lexington County, South Carolina. The trio kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 14-year-old Jackie Brooks and 17-year-old Thomas Taylor. The crime was gruesome, and when the suspects were caught, the public demanded the death penalty. At trial, Roach's defense team argued that he was not the mastermind. He was just a teenager following older, more violent criminals. His low IQ and lack of maturity should have been mitigating factors, but the jury still sentenced him to death in 1978. Over the next 8 years, human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, fought to spare his life. Even the United Nations and European leaders urged the U.S. to reconsider executing a mentally impaired teenager. But South Carolina refused to grant clemency. On January 10, 1986, at the age of 25, James Terry Roach was executed in the electric chair at the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Joseph John Cannon. Joseph John Cannon was only 17 years old when he was sentenced to death for the murder of a woman during a burglary. But his case stood out for another reason. His horrific childhood became the focal point of his defense, sparking debate over whether the death penalty should apply to juveniles who had endured extreme abuse. Born in 1979, Cannon's life was a nightmare from the very beginning. He was subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse, neglected and abandoned multiple times. By the time he was a teenager, he had already attempted suicide multiple times and was diagnosed with severe mental health issues. In 1995, at the age of 17, Cannon broke into the home of Ann Walsh, a 45-year-old Houston woman, intending to steal valuables. But when she confronted him, he shot her in the head at close range. He later claimed that the murder was not planned, but rather a spur-of-the-moment reaction fueled by panic. At trial, the prosecution portrayed him as a ruthless criminal, while his defense argued that his traumatic upbringing left him mentally unstable and incapable of making rational decisions. Despite the evidence of his severe mental health struggles, the jury sentenced him to death in 1996. His appeals focused on his history of abuse and his young age at the time of the crime, but Texas courts refused to grant him clemency. On April 22, 1998, at the age of 21, Joseph John Cannon was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. Curtis Harris. Curtis Harris was 17 years old when he was sentenced to death in Texas for the murder of a police officer. His case, however, raised serious questions about the use of coerced confessions, especially when dealing with juvenile suspects. Born in 1975, Harris grew up in poverty in rural Texas, raised by a single mother who struggled to keep her family afloat. His early years were marked by run-ins with the law, though mostly for minor offenses. But on May 22, 1992, his life took a dark turn when he was arrested for the murder of Officer James Hall in Harris County, Texas. According to the police, Harris had been involved in a robbery that ended in the officer's fatal shooting. But from the start, his defense team insisted that his confession was coerced. Harris, who had limited education and no legal guidance at the time of his arrest, was interrogated for hours. His lawyers later claimed that detectives pressured him into admitting to the crime, despite evidence suggesting he wasn't the shooter. Nevertheless, the jury sided with the prosecution, and in 1993, Curtis Harris was sentenced to death. His case gained national attention, with activists arguing that Texas had sentenced a teenager to die based on a potentially false confession. But despite numerous appeals, his sentence remained unchanged. On July 1, 1993, at the age of 18, Curtis Harris was executed by lethal injection. Roy Burgess. Roy Burgess was just 17 years old when he committed a robbery-turned-murder that led to his execution in Texas in 2000. His case, like many others, highlighted the debate over executing juveniles with traumatic pasts and whether their backgrounds should have played a role in sentencing. Born in 1982, Burgess had a deeply troubled upbringing marked by abuse, neglect, and exposure to violence. His early life was filled with instability, bouncing between foster homes and juvenile detention centers. But by his late teens, he had turned to armed robbery, a choice that would ultimately seal his fate. On June 11, 1999, Burgess and an accomplice, Michael Ellis, attempted to rob a convenience store in Houston, Texas. The robbery quickly escalated, and Burgess shot and killed the store's owner, 42-year-old Richard Powell, in what prosecutors called a cold-blooded execution. His trial was swift and unforgiving. Prosecutors emphasized his criminal history and painted him as a violent threat to society. Meanwhile, his defense team argued that Burgess had endured a lifetime of severe trauma and lacked the emotional maturity to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. The jury showed no leniency, and in 2000, he was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals citing his traumatic childhood and young age, the Texas courts refused to overturn his sentence. On May 4, 2000, at the age of 18, Roy Burgess was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Christopher Thomas. Christopher Thomas was 17 years old when he committed a murder during a store robbery, sealing his fate as one of the last juveniles executed in the United States before the Supreme Court banned juvenile executions in Roper v. Simmons, 2005. Born in Texas in 1987, Thomas had a troubled upbringing, growing up in an unstable household. He struggled in school and frequently got into trouble with the law, often for petty crimes and theft. But in 2004, his actions turned deadly. On September 12, 2004, Thomas and an accomplice entered a convenience store in Houston, Texas, intending to commit armed robbery. The situation escalated when Thomas shot and killed the store clerk, 45-year-old Daniel Vega, before fleeing the scene. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies led to his swift arrest. At trial, Thomas' defense attorneys argued for leniency, citing his young age and lack of maturity, but the jury showed no sympathy. In 2004, he was sentenced to death. Despite growing opposition to executing juvenile offenders, Texas carried out the sentence before the Supreme Court ruling could save him. On March 3, 2005, at the age of 18, Christopher Thomas was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. His execution took place just days before the Supreme Court officially ruled that executing juveniles was unconstitutional. Scott Hain. Scott Hayne was 17 years old when he committed a brutal double murder that would also make him one of the last juveniles executed in the United States before the Supreme Court outlawed the practice. Born in Oklahoma in 1970, Hayne had a troubled upbringing, spending much of his youth involved in petty crimes and delinquency. But in 1987, his crimes escalated into something far more sinister. On October 6, 1987, Hayne and his 21-year-old accomplice, Robert Lambert, carjacked a couple, Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The victims were bound and locked inside the trunk of their own car before Hayne and Lambert set the vehicle on fire, burning both Houghton and Sanders alive. The shocking cruelty of the crime horrified the public and ensured that prosecutors would seek the death penalty. At trial, Hayne's defense argued that he was just a reckless teenager following an older accomplice's lead, but the jury was unmoved. In 1988, Hayne was sentenced to death for the double murder. While on death row, Hayne's lawyers fought to have his sentence commuted, especially as the international community increasingly condemned the U.S. for executing people who committed crimes as minors. Even though the Supreme Court later ruled in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, that juveniles could no longer be executed, Hayne did not live to see that day. On April 3, 2003, at the age of 32, Scott Hayne was executed by lethal injection in McAlester, Oklahoma. Dwayne Allen Wright. Dwayne Allen Wright was just 17 years old when he committed a violent robbery-turned-murder that would lead to his execution in Virginia in 1998. Born in Virginia in 1977, Wright had a troubled childhood, often finding himself in trouble with the law from an early age. By his teens, he had dropped out of school and was deeply involved in criminal activity. On November 6, 1994, Wright and an accomplice, Douglas Christopher Thomas, carried out a botched robbery that ended in the murder of 19-year-old William Wiggins. Wright later admitted to shooting Wiggins' execution style. Though he claimed it was not premeditated, at his trial prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. Portraying Wright as a remorseless killer, his defense attorneys argued that his age and immaturity should have been mitigating factors. But the jury showed no mercy. Wright was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1995. As his execution date neared, civil rights advocates raised concerns about racial bias in his sentencing. Studies had shown that black defendants were far more likely to receive the death penalty in cases where the victim was white. Furthermore, Wright had borderline intellectual disability, which his lawyers argued should have disqualified him from execution under evolving legal standards. Despite national and international protests, Wright's appeals were repeatedly denied. On October 14, 1998, at the age of 22, he was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Kenneth Young. Kenneth Young was just 15 years old when he was sentenced to death in Florida, making him one of the youngest people ever put on death row in the United States. But unlike others, Young's story took a different turn. His sentence was later overturned after years of legal battles. Young was born into poverty in Tampa, Florida, and had no father figure growing up. His mother was addicted to hard substances, and by the time he was a teenager, he had fallen in with the wrong crowd. At 15, he was recruited by an older man, Willie Boatman, to participate in a series of armed robberies. In 1999, Young and Boatman carried out a botched robbery that resulted in the murder of 68-year-old Janine Mumbauer. Even though Boatman was the actual shooter, prosecutors still charged Young with first-degree murder under Florida's felony murder law, which allows an accomplice to be sentenced as if they had pulled the trigger. In 2001, Young was sentenced to death, despite being only 15 years old at the time of the crime. His lawyers fought the ruling, arguing that he was manipulated by an adult and lacked the cognitive ability to understand the consequences of his actions. After a long legal battle, Young's death sentence was overturned in 2011, following the Supreme Court's decision in Graham v. Florida, which ruled that juveniles could not receive life without parole for non-homicide offenses. Young was resentenced to life in prison. Leonard Shockley, making him one of the youngest Americans put to death in the pre-1976 era. His crime was brutal, but the circumstances surrounding his execution remained controversial. Born in Maryland, Shockley was raised in a poverty-stricken household and was known for frequent run-ins with the law from an early age. But on April 8, 1958, he and his older brother, Harold Shockley, made a fatal decision. They broke into the home of Minnie Myrtle Blake, an elderly woman living in Worcester County, Maryland. During the burglary, the situation escalated, and Minnie Blake was shot and killed. Leonard, though only 16 at the time, was quickly arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His brother, Harold, was 18 and also faced trial. But what happened next stunned many. Harold, the older of the two, was sentenced to life in prison, while Leonard, the younger one, was sentenced to death. Because Maryland law at the time allowed the execution of minors, the state moved forward with its case, despite protests that executing a 16-year-old was both cruel and unusual. On April 10, 1959, at the age of 17, Leonard Shockley was executed in the gas chamber at the Maryland State Penitentiary. Shameik Gradine. Shameik Gradine was just 14 years old when he was sentenced to 70 years in prison, a punishment so extreme that it became one of the most controversial juvenile sentencing cases in U.S. history. Gradine grew up in a low-income neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, surrounded by crime and instability. By his early teens, he had already fallen in with the wrong crowd. But on April the 26th, 2009, his life changed forever. That night, Gradine, along with his co-defendant, 12-year-old Rasheem White, attempted to commit an armed robbery of a man named Michael Kugler. The boys were carrying a shotgun, but things quickly spiraled out of control. In a moment of panic and inexperience, Gradine fired a shot at Kugler, hitting him in the neck and shoulder. Fortunately, Kugler survived the attack and was able to testify against Gradine in court. Under normal circumstances, a 14-year-old might have been sent to a juvenile detention facility, but Florida had some of the harshest sentencing laws in the country for minors, allowing them to be charged as adults for violent crimes. Gradine was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and attempted armed robbery. The judge handed down a 70-year sentence without the possibility of parole, a punishment that all but guaranteed Gradine would die in prison for a crime he committed as a child. His case gained national attention when juvenile justice reform advocates argued that sentencing a 14-year-old to nearly a lifetime in prison was cruel and unusual. In 2010, the Supreme Court's ruling in Graham v. Florida banned life sentences for juveniles in non-homicide cases, which forced a review of Gradine's punishment. After years of legal battles, his sentence was reduced to 25 years in 2017. Antonio Richardson. Antonio Richardson was 16 years old when he took part in a brutal murder that landed him on Missouri's death row. Unlike many others on this list, Richardson was eventually spared from execution, but not because of mercy. Richardson grew up in a troubled environment, often in and out of juvenile detention centers for minor offenses. But on April 5, 1991, he and 3 older accomplices, including Marlon Gray, committed a horrific crime now known as the Chain of Rocks Bridge murders. That night, Richardson and his accomplices kidnapped, raped, and murdered 2 sisters, Julie Carey, 20, and Robin Carey, 19, by throwing them off the Chain of Rocks Bridge into the Mississippi River. The girls drowned, and their bodies were found days later. The brutality of the crime shocked the public and led to 4 death sentences, including one for Richardson, despite him being only 16 years old at the time. His defense attorneys argued that Richardson was a follower, not a leader, and that he lacked the full maturity to understand the consequences of his actions. Nonetheless, in 1993, he was sentenced to death alongside his accomplices. For years, Richardson sat on death row, awaiting execution. But in 2005, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Roper v. Simmons, which banned the execution of offenders who committed crimes under the age of 18. This decision saved Richardson's life. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole. They faced death, but before their final moments, they had something to say. Haunting confessions, disturbing justifications, and eerie last words. These are the final interviews of some of the most notorious serial killers. John Wayne Gacy.
In light of all that has been used against me in the media, they've created this fantasy monster image, and it's been going on for the last 12 years. And I've ever had no comment, and I had no need to talk to the media for the simple reason that they were looking for sensationalism and they were looking for the monster.
John Wayne Gacy, the man infamously known as the Killer Clown, was convicted of 33 murders, a crime so heinous that it sent shockwaves across America. He spent 14 years on death row, but until the very end, he maintained that the media had twisted the truth about him.
Well, the idea that I'm a homosexual thrill killer and all that garbage, and they painted this image of me that like I strolled down the streets and stalked young boys and slaughtered them. Hell, if you could see my schedule, my work schedule, you know damn well that I was never out there.
Born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy led a double life. By day, he was a successful businessman, deeply involved in local politics. By night, he was a predatory serial killer, luring young boys into his home under the guise of construction jobs, sexually assaulting them and strangling them to death. Many of the bodies were buried in the crawl space beneath his house. Despite confessing to his crimes upon his arrest in 1978, Gacy later denied any involvement.
The first search warrant was executed on December 13th. However, what is strange is you had 20 trained officers that came into that house, supposedly went down in the crawl space, crawled around. There was no mounds of dirt, there was no odor, there was no nothing.
Gacy wasn't just an average serial killer. He was well connected. He had photographs with high-profile figures, including First Lady Rosalind Carter.
Hell, I was in charge of the reception. I had to stand at the door and let them know which politicians were allowed in and which ones weren't.
He built a construction business, PDM Contractors, which made over $1 million a year, and claimed he was far too busy to have committed the murders.
If you could see my schedule, my work schedule, you know damn well that I was never out there.
But the bodies buried under his house told a different story. One of the most chilling aspects of Gacy's life was his persona as Pogo the Clown.
Clowning was relaxation for me. I enjoyed entertaining kids.
He denied using his clown identity as a lure, insisting he performed at hospitals and parades not to attract victims. But the gruesome reality was that behind the painted smile, he was a cold-blooded murderer. Gacy developed a signature method of killing his victims, a technique he referred to as the rope trick.
So if you're going to kill somebody, you just put it on their neck and twist it 3 times or 4 times or whatever till the person stopped moving.
After murdering them, he disposed of the bodies either in the crawl space beneath his home or dumped them into rivers.
I couldn't get down in the crawl space that easy, and then I had to bum back to begin with. You got to crawl on your belly to move around in the crawl space. There is no way that I could have done any of the digging down there.
Even with 29 bodies found on his property, Gacy insisted that others were involved in the killings.
We believe there was 4 people involved, and that would be Michael Rossi, David Cram, Philip Paskey.
Gacy accused his employees, including Michael Rossi and David Cram, of playing a role in the murders. He even went as far as suggesting that a child trafficking ring led by John Norman was connected to the crimes.
They were making snuff films with young boys. To me, they were pimping them off. They were selling them.
Yet, when pressed about his first known victim, Timothy McCoy, he admitted,
He was killed in the house in self-defense.
Gacy remained defiant until the end, convinced that the police had botched the investigation and that he was wrongfully convicted.
Just like I consider myself the 34th victim.
On May 10, 1994, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words before dying, "Kiss my ass." Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, often referred to as America's first female serial killer, was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. After killing 7 men along Florida highways, she insisted she was forced into it, a victim of a cruel world that exploited her, only to discard her when she was no longer useful. Her final interview was a chaotic outburst of rage, conspiracy theories, and bitter defiance.
I was just wondering how you're going to be, at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Are you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right. I'm all right with it.
For someone hours away from execution, Wuornos displayed no fear. She was calm, ready, but beneath that acceptance was deep-seated resentment toward law enforcement, the legal system, and society as a whole.
That I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up. And let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
Wuornos claimed that the police deliberately allowed her to continue killing, waiting for her to rack up more victims so they could turn her into a high-profile case for money, books, and movies. She saw herself as a pawn in a much larger game, her life exploited for profit. By the time Wuornos was on death row, she had developed severe paranoia, believing she was being tortured through sonic pressure and mind control experiments.
I was tortured at BCI. They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
She went on to describe hidden surveillance, an electrically rigged TV, and government agents monitoring her every move.
They're trying to make it look like I was crazy at all times, rig up the room with torture. If I said anything about I think their whole plan was to try to make it look like I was totally crazy, and so nobody would believe anything I had to say about anything.
Her increasingly erratic statements made it unclear what was reality and what was delusion. Wuornos claimed she killed out of self-defense, but when pressed, she dodged the question.
So are you saying that you killed in self-defense or in cold blood?
I'm not going to say it, I'm not going to get in depth about my cases, Nick. I'm on my way to the chamber, nothing stopping it. You can believe it or you don't have to believe it. That's up to you, man. Put a big question mark on your film.
She went from claiming self-defense to outright admitting to the murders, suggesting her hatred for men and society fueled her killing spree. She saw herself as a victim, but also showed no remorse.
I think it's going to be more like Star Trek beaming me up into a space vehicle, man.
Wuornos believed in life beyond Earth, that her execution would send her to another planet where she could start over. At 9:47 a.m. on October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words before entering the execution chamber were, "This is the last time I'm gonna say it. You have to kill Aileen Wuornos, because she'll kill again." By Arthur Shawcross. Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer, was convicted of 11 brutal murders, including sexual assault, mutilation, and alleged cannibalism. Before his death from cardiac arrest on November 10, 2008, Shawcross gave a disturbing final interview inside Sullivan Correctional Facility, where he detailed his twisted fantasies, lack of remorse, and horrifying confessions.
Can you tell me about what cannibalism occurred with your victims, your prostitute victims?
Shawcross at first seemed reluctant to answer.
That's hard to talk about, lady.
But then he admitted to cutting body parts out, specifically the vaginas of 3 victims, before consuming them. When asked why, he had no answer.
Why? I don't know.
Forensic evidence supported mutilation, but whether he actually cannibalized his victims remains uncertain. Many believe he exaggerated his crimes to create an infamous legend around himself, much like Hannibal Lecter. Shawcross claimed his mother sexually abused him from the age of 4.
She had me put my head between her legs.
His mother denied all accusations, and no evidence ever confirmed his claims. Some experts believe he fabricated childhood trauma to justify his sick behavior. Despite this, psychiatrists agree that severe maternal disruption can lead to antisocial behavior. Shawcross alleged that he first tasted human flesh during his time in Vietnam.
He claims it was there he first discovered a taste for human flesh. He says he tracked 2 Viet Cong women in the jungle, ambushed them, and tied one to a tree alive, while he cut up and cooked the other.
He described the gruesome details of slicing off a woman's leg, removing the skin, fat, and cords, and roasting it over a fire. When asked what human flesh tastes like, he replied,
You take a fresh ham, a roast pork, and it's the butt end where it's a little burnt. That's what you taste like.
Military records do not confirm Shawcross's Vietnam combat experience, leading many to believe his cannibalism stories were fictional fantasies. In 1972, Shawcross's first known victims were 2 innocent children, Jack Owen Blake, age 10, and Karen Hill, age 8. Shawcross later admitted to eating Blake's genitals. When confronted, his tone changed.
Because I won't talk about it.
The reporter pressed him further. It was the only moment in the interview where he refused to elaborate, suggesting shame, fear, or even a rare flicker of remorse. When asked if he felt sorry for his victims, Shawcross responded without emotion.
I think about a lot of things, but for some reason, I don't have a conscience.
His lack of guilt or empathy made him even more terrifying. He was fully aware of what he did, but felt nothing. Even when discussing the pain he caused to victims' families, he remained indifferent. After his arrest, doctors discovered major brain abnormalities. Brain scans showed his prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, was severely damaged. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10, 2008, from cardiac arrest. Michael Bruce Ross. As Michael Bruce Ross, the man known as the Roadside Strangler, sat on death row, he showed no fear of his impending execution. Unlike many on death row, he did not fight for his life. He embraced death as justice. Born on July 26, 1959, Ross grew up in a deeply dysfunctional home. His mother physically abused him and his siblings, and some reports suggested he had been molested by his uncle, who later committed suicide. Despite his troubled childhood, Ross was a gifted student. He attended Cornell University, where his dark tendencies began to emerge. He admitted to stalking women in their dorms, finding pleasure in their fear. During his sophomore year, those fantasies turned into action. Between 1981 and 1984, Ross murdered 8 females across Connecticut and New York. 7 of his victims were sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. His youngest known victim was just 14 years old. Eventually, Ross was caught, linked to multiple murders, and in 1987, he confessed to all 8 killings. He was convicted for 4 murders and sentenced to death in Connecticut. Ross spent 18 years on death row, awaiting execution. In his final hours, he remained composed, even finding amusement in his sentencing process. Unlike most inmates, Ross did not request a special last meal. He ate the standard prison meal of the day, a final sign of his resignation. When asked if he had any last words before execution, he simply said, "No, thank you." On May 13, 2005, at 2:25 a.m., Michael Bruce Ross was executed by lethal injection at Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. He was 45 years old. Joseph Paul Franklin.
Do you think you deserve to die?
To be quite honest with you, I cannot say no to that question.
Joseph Paul Franklin, a white supremacist, serial killer, and domestic terrorist, was responsible for at least 22 murders across the United States. His racially motivated attacks targeted black, Jewish, and interracial couples, fueled by an obsession with starting a race war. After decades on death row, Franklin gave a final interview reflecting on his crimes, his radicalization, and his impending execution.
Joseph, you've been on death row now for what, 16 years?
Yeah, about 16 years.
And now the execution date is drawing very near. What are your feelings with that?
Franklin admitted he hoped for a stay of execution, clinging to the possibility of having his sentence commuted to life without parole. When asked why he confessed to the Richmond Heights sniping, Franklin made a startling claim. He said a dream told him to confess.
I had a dream that told me to confess to the Richmond Heights case.
However, he also suggested that his confession was a survival tactic, revealing that guards at the Marion Federal Penitentiary had planned to kill him after he assaulted one of them. According to Franklin, he had 2 choices: stay in federal prison and be murdered by guards, or confess and get transferred to death row.
So I chose the former to be, take my chances over here on death row.
On October 8, 1977, Franklin opened fire outside a synagogue in Richmond Heights, Missouri, killing Gerald Gordon and injuring 2 others. When asked why he did it, Franklin's response was chilling.
I thought I was actually doing the right thing.
He admitted that his hatred for Jewish people was fueled by Nazi literature, particularly Mein Kampf.
And when you continue reading that crap all the time, you eventually start to believe it. It just starts to soak into your psyche, I guess,
At just 18 years old, Franklin became involved with the American Nazi Party, immersing himself in white supremacist propaganda that brainwashed him into committing murder.
Do you remember the details of that day?
Yeah, most of them. Yeah, I remember what happened.
Franklin waited outside the synagogue with a sniper rifle, aiming at unsuspecting worshipers as they exited after a bar mitzvah. As soon as he saw a group of people, he opened fire, hitting Gerald Gordon. He then fired several more bullets randomly before dropping his rifle, jumping on a bicycle, and escaping. Despite his hatred-fueled attack, Franklin admitted that at the time, his overwhelming feeling was fear.
I know I was, very afraid, you know what I mean? I don't know why, just terrified sitting there.
He did not feel remorse at the time, only fear of being caught by the police. Franklin admitted that the attack was a terrible crime, saying he deeply regretted his actions. He blamed his actions on mental illness, saying his mind had been warped by Nazi ideology. By 1980, Franklin had killed at least 22 people across multiple states. When asked about the total number of his victims, Franklin refused to answer.
Well, I really don't want to go into any numbers at this point in time.
His murder spree included interracial couples he deemed race traitors, black men and women, Jewish targets, including his synagogue shooting, Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler magazine, whom he attempted to assassinate in 1978. When asked if he deserved to be executed, Franklin gave a rare moment of truth.
To be quite honest with you, I cannot say no to that question.
He accepted his fate, but held on to the hope of a last-minute stay of execution. After decades in prison, Franklin claimed to have abandoned his racist beliefs after studying world religions. He said he regretted everything he did, blaming his violent past on Nazi propaganda and ignorance. He even expressed a desire to reach out to Gerald Gordon's family and apologize, though he was advised not to.
But I would apologize to her right now, tell her I'm sorry for the horrible crime that I committed, and ask for her forgiveness.
On November 20th, 2013, Joseph Paul Franklin was executed by lethal injection at Bonne Terre, Missouri. His final words in his last interview were an admission of guilt. Joseph Paul Franklin's reign of terror ended in execution, but the scars of his crime still haunt his victims and their families. Wesley Allen Dodd.
Why do you want to be executed?
I have to be. Because I will kill again. No, I would do it again. I've been molesting kids nonstop since I was 13 years old, over half my life. Anything happened, I can guarantee I'd do it again, and sooner or later I would kill another child.
Unlike most serial killers who deny their crimes, Wesley Allen Dodd openly admitted that he was beyond saving. He had no remorse, no hesitation, only a dark certainty that if he was ever free again, he would continue his reign of terror. On September 4th, 1989, Dodd set out with a filler knife and shoelaces, looking for victims in David Douglas Park, Vancouver. He lured two brothers, Cole and William, into a secluded area, tied them to a tree, and assaulted them before stabbing them to death. The brutality of the crime stunned investigators, but it was only the beginning. Dodd struck again, targeting Lee Isley, a young boy he abducted, tortured, and eventually strangled to death in one of his most heinous crimes. He later confessed that he enjoyed every moment of it. Despite this, he claimed to occasionally reflect on the horrors he committed. "How do you live with yourself daily?" the interviewer asked. Dodd exhaled.
At times it's not easy. I said there's times I think about what I've done. I think about some of the things the boys said before they died, and that's real hard to think.
His capture came in November 1989, when he attempted to kidnap a boy from a movie theater restroom. This time, the child fought back, alerting security. Dodd fled, but in a cruel twist of fate, his car broke down, allowing the boy's father to catch him. He was arrested, and during interrogation, he admitted to 3 murders and multiple assaults. Given the choice between lethal injection and hanging, Dodd chose to be hanged, the same method he used to kill his last victim. When asked if he looked forward to dying, his answer was unsettling.
In a way, yeah, I think it'd be a relief. I don't have to think about all these things anymore.
On January 5th, 1993, at 12:05 a.m., Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging at the Washington State Penitentiary, the first hanging in the U.S. since 1965. Ted Bundy.
Do you deserve the punishment the state has inflicted upon you?
I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure.
As the hours ticked down before his execution, Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in history, sat down for his final interview. It was January the 23rd, 1989, and by the next morning, he would be dead. He spoke calmly, yet his words carried a chilling weight, an acknowledgement of the horrors he had committed. His crime spanned years, leaving a trail of victims across multiple states. Bundy's charm and intelligence masked the monster within. He would lure unsuspecting women by pretending to need help, sometimes wearing a sling or a fake cast, only to kidnap, assault, and murder them. In 1975, he picked up Lynette Dawn Culver, offering her a ride. He took her to a hotel, assaulted her, and drowned her in the bathtub. She was just one of at least 33 women Bundy is believed to have killed. His methods were as brutal as they were calculated. Many victims were beaten unconscious, strangled, and even decapitated, with Bundy keeping their severed heads as trophies in his apartment. Despite his public image as a charming law student, Bundy's appetite for violence was insatiable. He confessed to being heavily influenced by pornography and alcohol, saying they fueled his fantasies until he could no longer stop himself from acting on them. When asked about his first murder, Bundy described waking up the next morning in horror, but the remorse never lasted. Over time, he became desensitized to the violence. Bundy was finally captured in 1978 after a cross-country killing spree that ended in Florida, where he brutally murdered 2 college students and a 12-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach. The public outcry over her death was overwhelming. When asked about Kimberly Leach's murder, Bundy struggled to respond.
I can't really talk about that right now. That's
too painful.
His trial became a media spectacle, but in the end, justice caught up to him. Bundy was sentenced to death by electrocution and spent nearly a decade on death row. In his final moments, he appeared composed but acknowledged the weight of his crimes. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Carol Cole.
Do you deserve to die?
Cole paused, then nodded.
For what I did, yes, I think I deserve to die.
Hours before his execution, Carol Cole sat in his prison cell, calm but visibly drained. He admitted time was moving fast, the weight of his crime settling in. Yet, despite the reality of death creeping closer, he showed no desire to fight for his life. Why not fight for your life? The interviewer asked.
I just don't care to.
That same apathy had fueled decades of killing, with Cole claiming at least 35 victims, most of them women. His methods were cold and calculated. He would strangle, stab, and drown his victims, often targeting vulnerable women in bars, motels, and isolated areas. In some cases, their bodies were dumped in rivers. In others, they were left in remote locations where no one would find them for weeks. One of his most gruesome murders was that of Marie Cushman in Las Vegas, 1979. He met her in a bar, charmed her just enough to lure her to a motel, and once they were alone, he wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her until she stopped breathing. But of all his crimes, one victim haunted him the most, an 11-year-old girl he killed in the 1960s.
But I thought about it and condemned myself for many years.
Cole admitted.
Because I can just imagine what her life might have been like.
After serving 5 years in prison for that crime, Cole came out even more violent. Over the next 9 years, he murdered 14 more women, each death more brutal than the last. His victims weren't just statistics. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters, all unsuspecting until the moment he decided they wouldn't live another day. By 1981, his luck ran out. Investigators linked him to 3 murders in Texas, and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But after his mother's death in 1984, something changed. He confessed to additional murders, handing himself over for a death sentence in Nevada. As execution neared, a lingering fear remained. On December 6, 1985, at exactly 2:01 a.m., Carol Cole was executed by lethal injection at Nevada State Prison. Oscar Ray Bolin.
Imagine spending 28 years in this room. There's no way to describe it.
Oscar Ray Bolin had spent 28 years on death row, convicted of 3 brutal murders, yet he insisted he was not the man responsible. Born on January 22, 1962 in Portland, Indiana, Bolin's life was marred by abuse and violence from an early age. His father beat him regularly, and his mother once walked him to the school bus on a leash. This unstable upbringing led him into a life of crime, with his first arrest for theft at 15. By the mid-1980s, Bolin had moved to Florida, where he worked as a carnival worker and married his girlfriend, Cheryl Hafner. But behind the illusion of normalcy, women were dying. On January 25, 1986, Natalie Blanche Holly, a 25-year-old night manager at Church's Fried Chicken, locked up the restaurant and walked to her car. She never made it home. The next morning, her body was found, stabbed repeatedly. Months later, on November 5, 1986, Stephanie Collins, a high school student, vanished after leaving work. A month later, her body was discovered wrapped in sheets and towels, with her skull crushed, and stab wounds covering her body. That same day, 26-year-old Terry Lynn Matthews went missing. Her car was found running outside a post office, but she was nowhere in sight. Later, her body was discovered in the woods, wrapped in a white sheet, her throat slashed. Bolin might have evaded justice longer, but in 1987, he and 2 other men kidnapped, raped, and attempted to murder a waitress in Ohio. When he tried to shoot her, the gun jammed, forcing them to dump her on the highway instead. The waitress survived and identified Bolin, leading to his arrest and a 22-year prison sentence. It wasn't until his ex-wife's new husband called a tip line that investigators connected him to the unsolved murders in Florida. His half-brother and cousin testified against him, sealing his fate. Even as his execution approached, Bolin refused to admit guilt, but the evidence and the testimony told a different story. On January 7, 2016, at 10:16 p.m., Oscar Ray Bolin was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His final words, "At least I had options. There are worse ways to go." Ed Wayne Edwards.
I was always a schemer. I was always thinking of ways of making money. I've always been into crime.
In his final interview, Ed Wayne Edwards admitted to plotting the cold-blooded murder of his foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, all in the name of greed. Unlike most killers, Edwards thrived on notoriety, craving attention, even as he confessed to his horrific crimes. When asked if Danny was truly his son, he was blunt.
He was not a foster son. He was not an adopted son. He was someone that we had taken in.
Edwards had spent decades deceiving people. Born on June 14, 1933 in Akron, Ohio, he was raised in an orphanage where he suffered physical and sexual abuse from nuns. By his early 20s, he was robbing gas stations, escaping prison, and making headlines. He even landed on the FBI's most wanted list, but after a third arrest, he managed to secure parole in just 5 years. At first, it seemed like he had turned his life around. He got married, wrote a book, and even became a motivational speaker, appearing on TV shows. But behind the scenes, Edwards was still a killer. In 1977, he shot and killed a couple, William Lavaco and Judith Straub, execution style, in a field. 3 years later, he stabbed and strangled 2 brothers, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, leaving their bodies in the woods. But his most sinister crime was the calculated murder of his own foster son. Danny was a young soldier in the U.S. Army, and Edwards saw him as nothing more than an insurance payout. He convinced Danny to desert the military, then took out a $250,000 life insurance policy in his name. The scheme was simple: lure Danny into the woods and execute him.
I told him that there was a fellow in Youngstown that was going to come by, pick him up, and hide him out for a couple months, and then he would be clear. He wouldn't have to worry about anything.
Edwards then left the body partially covered, checking back every few months to make sure it was still there. When wild animals scattered the remains, he collected Danny's skull and threw it into a field, ensuring police would never find it. He thought he had gotten away with it. For years, his crimes went undetected, until an unexpected tip-off from his own biological son led police to him. Once in custody, Edwards confessed to multiple murders, but initially denied killing Danny. It wasn't until a jailhouse confession that authorities had enough evidence to charge him. Unlike most death row inmates, Edwards chose lethal injection himself, claiming his body was too weak to keep living, but he never made it to execution. On April 7, 2011, Ed Wayne Edwards died of natural causes, 4 months before he was scheduled to be put to death. His final words, "I am not proud of any of this, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it for anybody to follow." Born into a family that committed over 600 crimes, Nico Jenkins took it to a whole new level. Claiming to hear commands from a so-called Egyptian serpent god, he went on a murderous spree, leaving Omaha in shock. From carving 666 into his forehead to suing the state for $245 million, and with his family egging him on, was it truly sacrifice for Apophis or pure madness? Early life. Nico Allen Jenkins was born on September 16, 1986, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a family deeply involved in criminal activity. His mother, Lori Jenkins, and father, David McGee, had multiple run-ins with the law, setting an example that would shape Nico's future. His mother was involved in fraud and drug-related offenses, while his father had an extensive history of violent crimes. Collectively, the Jenkins family had committed at least 633 crimes dating back to 1979, a staggering number that painted a grim picture of Nico's upbringing. Nico was surrounded by relatives who saw crime as a way of life. His sister, Erica Jenkins, would later become his closest accomplice in his darkest deeds, while his cousin, Christine Bordeaux, also played a role in his eventual murder spree. From an early age, he was exposed to violence, substance abuse, and a total disregard for the law, which normalized criminal behavior in his eyes. It didn't take long for Nico to display violent tendencies. On October 25, 1993, when he was just 7 years old, he brought a loaded handgun to school. The incident, though without casualties, was beyond unusual in Omaha's school district and put Nico on the police radar for the first time. Law enforcement officers, teachers, and social workers saw this as an early red flag, but attempts to intervene did little to curb his growing aggression. As Nico moved through his childhood, reports of violent outbursts at home and school became more frequent. Teachers noted his inability to focus and his disturbing fascination with weapons. By the time he reached middle school, he had been suspended multiple times for fighting and making threats. Despite efforts from the juvenile justice system to intervene, Nico's behavior continued to escalate. At the age of 17, Jenkins was arrested for armed robbery in 2003, marking the beginning of his serious criminal record. He and a group of friends targeted a woman at gunpoint, stealing her vehicle and personal belongings. This offense landed him a 20-year prison sentence, but authorities hoped that incarceration would rehabilitate him. Unfortunately, his time behind bars only fueled his violent nature. In 2009, during a brief release from prison to attend his grandmother's funeral, Nico and his sister Erica seized the opportunity to attack a correctional officer who had been assigned to escort them. The incident resulted in additional charges, and both siblings were sent back to prison with extended sentences. This brazen act of defiance highlighted the deep-seated aggression within the Jenkins family. While serving time, Nico became increasingly volatile. He spent most of his sentence in solitary confinement due to violent behavior toward fellow inmates and prison staff. Prison reports indicated that he frequently engaged in self-harm, carving symbols into his skin and exhibiting erratic behavior. During his years in solitary confinement, Jenkins began claiming that he was hearing voices from Apophis, the ancient Egyptian serpent god of darkness. He told prison staff that Apophis was instructing him to commit violent acts and sacrifices. These alarming statements were often dismissed as manipulative tactics to gain attention or special treatment, but they were clear indications of his deteriorating mental state. Throughout his troubled life, Nico remained heavily influenced by his mother, Lori Jenkins. She played a significant role in his criminal mindset, often justifying his violent behavior and providing unwavering support even as he descended further into darkness. Lori's involvement in criminal activity, including buying firearms illegally, would later land her in prison as well. During his time behind bars, Nico communicated regularly with Lori, who continued to reinforce his delusions and beliefs about his so-called spiritual mission. Instead of seeking help for her son, Lori encouraged his destructive tendencies, helping him obtain weapons and evade authorities when necessary. Despite countless interactions with the criminal justice system, Jenkins was repeatedly failed by those meant to rehabilitate him. Mental health evaluations conducted during his incarceration pointed to severe antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic traits. However, Jenkins often manipulated psychologists, leading to conflicting reports about his mental state. His claims of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder were dismissed as fabrications, yet prison records documented his erratic behavior, including talking to himself, self-inflicted wounds, and threats against staff. The Nebraska Department of Corrections faced criticism for its inability to properly diagnose and treat him before releasing him into society. On July 30, 2013, after serving 10 years of a 20-year sentence for a 2002 carjacking, Nico Jenkins walked out of prison a free man with no probation or parole supervision. Family members celebrated his return with a party where, shockingly, they gifted him a shotgun, a weapon that would later be used in his killing spree. Within weeks of his release, Nico's paranoia and violent tendencies worsened. He spoke frequently about purging society and claimed that his release was a sign from Apophis that it was time to carry out his dark mission. With his mother, Lori Jenkins, his sister, Erica Jenkins, and his cousin, Christine Bordeaux, supporting him, there was little hope of him integrating back into normal life. The streets of Omaha were about to witness a series of senseless bloodshed. The crimes. Jenkins wasted no time getting back to his violent ways. On the night of August 11, 2013, he lured two unsuspecting victims, Juan Uribe Pena and Jorge Cajiga Ruiz, to Omaha's Spring Lake Park under the pretense of a sexual encounter. Jenkins, assisted by his sister Erica and cousin Christine, promised the men they would meet women, but instead, it was a trap. Once inside a white Ford pickup truck, Jenkins pulled out the shotgun and executed both men with a single shot to the head. Their bodies were later found by a parole officer patrolling the area at 5:01 a.m. The brutal execution-style killings sent shockwaves through the community, leaving police with few leads and no immediate suspects. Investigators at the scene noted the victims' wallets and phones were missing, leading them to believe the murders were robbery-related. However, Jenkins had something far darker in mind. He claimed the killings were sacrifices for Apophis, the ancient Egyptian serpent god he believed spoke to him. 8 days later, Jenkins struck again. This time his victim wasn't a stranger. It was Curtis Bradford, a former prison acquaintance. The two had met while incarcerated, and just 24 hours before Bradford's murder, Jenkins posted a now infamous Facebook photo with him. On the night of August 18th, Jenkins, Erica, and Curtis were seen driving through the city. Jenkins told Bradford they were planning a series of robberies and convinced him to join. But once they reached their destination, a garage near 18th and Clark Street, Jenkins handed Curtis an unloaded gun and staged a setup. Erica, without hesitation, shot Curtis twice in the back of the head, with Nico following up to ensure the kill. His reasoning? He wanted the honor of taking the life himself. Bradford's body was discovered the next morning, and by then, Jenkins was already planning his next attack. Unlike the previous victims, Andrea Kruger, a 33-year-old mother of three, had no connection to Jenkins. On her way home from work in the early hours of August 21st, Andrea was stopped at an intersection near 168th and 4th Streets when she was brutally ambushed. Jenkins dragged her from her SUV and shot her 4 times, once in the head, neck, and twice in the back. Her body was left in the street, and Jenkins sped off in her vehicle. This random act of violence shook Omaha to its core. Police worked around the clock, now aware that a serial killer was on the loose. Andrea's murder was unlike the others. It had no ritualistic ties or deceptive lures. It was an act of sheer brutality, possibly committed in an attempt to steal her vehicle and escape town. But Jenkins wasn't a criminal mastermind. His reckless actions were piling up, and law enforcement was closing in. Despite his apparent confidence in evading law enforcement, Jenkins left a trail of evidence that ultimately led to his arrest. First, detectives obtained surveillance footage showing Lori Jenkins purchasing the very shotgun used in the murders. That crucial piece of evidence connected the weapon to the Jenkins family, and it didn't take long for investigators to build their case. But it was Jenkins' reckless behavior at his own release party that sealed his fate. During the celebration, he had an argument with his girlfriend and made violent threats against her. Fearing for her life, she reported him to the police. This complaint provided authorities with the perfect opportunity to bring him in for questioning. Once Jenkins was in custody, police began linking him to the murders through forensic evidence, ballistics, and witness testimonies. His involvement became even more apparent during his 8-hour-long interrogation, where his conflicting stories began to unravel. During the intense interrogation session on September 3, 2013, Jenkins initially attempted to justify his actions by citing ritualistic sacrifices to Apophis. He described elaborate ceremonies and claimed that the murders were offerings to gain favor with the serpent god. As investigators pressed him, Jenkins' story began to shift. He blamed his family, claiming that Erica and Christine orchestrated the killings while he only provided intelligence. Later, he pointed fingers at the Nebraska correctional system, arguing that years in solitary confinement had driven him to madness. However, Jenkins' lack of remorse and erratic behavior during questioning only reinforced the notion that he was a calculated killer. He laughed at investigators, spoke in riddles, and even bragged about his actions in disturbing detail. Within just 3 weeks of his release, Nico Jenkins claimed 4 lives in a spree that highlighted serious flaws in the criminal justice system. The trial. On February 19, 2014, while awaiting trial for the brutal murders of 4 people, Nico Jenkins made an unexpected move. He filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Nebraska. In his complaint, Jenkins demanded a staggering $245 million, claiming that his wrongful release from prison and lack of proper mental health care were to blame for his crimes. According to Jenkins, years of solitary confinement had worsened his alleged schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, conditions he insisted were ignored by prison officials. However, psychiatric evaluations conducted during the trial painted a different picture. Court-appointed psychologists found no evidence of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Instead, they diagnosed Jenkins with antisocial personality disorder, a condition characterized by persistent disregard for others and a lack of remorse. The findings were a critical blow to Jenkins' defense, weakening his claims that his crimes were the result of the mental illness rather than calculated violence. Despite mounting evidence against him, Jenkins remained committed to his narrative, blaming the correctional system for his actions. His lawsuit, though ultimately dismissed, reflected his unwavering belief that he was the victim in the case, rather than the perpetrator of a heinous crime spree. In a move that left many stunned, Nico Jenkins chose to represent himself during his trial, despite his history of erratic and violent behavior. Legal experts expressed concerns about his competency, but Jenkins insisted that he was fully capable of handling his defense. His decision turned the courtroom into a bizarre and unsettling spectacle. Throughout the proceedings, Jenkins engaged in strange and unsettling behavior. He frequently spoke in tongues, muttered incomprehensible statements, and even laughed during graphic testimonies detailing the deaths of his victims. In some instances, he made direct threats to the prosecution and exhibited a complete lack of remorse for his actions. The jury and courtroom spectators were visibly disturbed by his antics. While some believed Jenkins was attempting to manipulate the proceedings by appearing mentally unfit, others saw his behavior as evidence of genuine psychological distress. Regardless of intent, his actions only solidified his reputation as a dangerous and unstable individual. The prosecution meticulously built a compelling case against Jenkins, presenting an overwhelming amount of forensic evidence and witness testimonies. Ballistics experts confirmed that the shotgun used in all 4 murders was the same weapon Jenkins had received from his family upon his release from prison. Surveillance footage also played a key role in the case. Investigators uncovered video evidence of Jenkins' mother, Lori Jenkins, purchasing the shotgun at a local store, linking the weapon directly to the Jenkins family. Additionally, cell phone records placed Jenkins at the crime scenes during the times of the murders, further strengthening the prosecution's argument. Witnesses, including Jenkins' ex-girlfriend, provided damning testimony. She recounted his threats and violent tendencies, detailing how Jenkins had boasted about his crimes and expressed a desire to commit more murders. Despite Jenkins' attempts to portray himself as mentally incompetent, the prosecution argued that he was fully aware of his actions and meticulously planned each murder. The evidence suggested a pattern of calculated brutality rather than random acts of violence driven by mental illness. After weeks of dramatic testimony and erratic courtroom behavior, the verdict finally came on April 16, 2014. Nico Jenkins was found guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for a short period before reaching their decision, as the evidence against Jenkins was overwhelming. The conviction sent a wave of relief through Omaha, bringing some closure to the families of the victims. However, in the months following his conviction, Jenkins' sentencing was delayed multiple times due to concerns about his mental health. While awaiting his fate, he engaged in increasingly bizarre and violent acts of self-mutilation. In one of the most shocking incidents, Jenkins carved the number 666 into his forehead, an act that further fueled speculation about his mental state. He later attempted to carve his forehead into the shape of a serpent, claiming it was a tribute to Apophis, the Egyptian serpent god he believed was guiding him. Prison officials reported that Jenkins required 27 stitches after one particularly gruesome self-harm attempt. Despite these incidents, psychiatric evaluations continued to determine that Jenkins was fit to stand trial and face sentencing. The court remained firm in its stance that his actions were deliberate and manipulative rather than the result of genuine mental illness. On May 30, 2017, after years of legal proceedings and delays, Jenkins was officially sentenced to death. The judge handed down the ruling, citing the extreme brutality of the murders and Jenkins' complete lack of remorse. In addition to the death sentence, he was also given a 450-year prison sentence for related charges, including the use of a deadly weapon and felon in possession of a firearm. Jenkins was not the only one facing justice. His mother, Lori Jenkins, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for purchasing the firearm used in the killings. She maintained that she had no knowledge of her son's intentions, but the court found her culpable in enabling his crimes. His sister, Erica Jenkins, who played a more direct role in the murders, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The court deemed her an active participant in the planning and execution of the killings, particularly the murder of Curtis Bradford. Jenkins' cousin, Christine Bordeaux, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in luring victims and assisting with logistics. While not directly involved in the killings, her cooperation with Jenkins placed her behind bars for a significant portion of her life. The final days. Since being sentenced to death on May 30th, 2017, Nico Jenkins has remained on death row at the Nebraska State Penitentiary awaiting execution. But for Jenkins, the wait has been anything but quiet. His case has been marked by legal battles, disturbing behavior, and ongoing mental health evaluations that continue to delay his ultimate fate. Following his sentencing, Jenkins intensified his claims of severe mental illness, arguing that his crimes were the result of untreated psychological conditions. He insisted that his time in solitary confinement exacerbated his schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, although multiple psychiatric evaluations found no credible evidence of these conditions. Instead, experts diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, a condition characterized by a lack of empathy and manipulative tendencies. Jenkins' legal team has repeatedly filed motions arguing that his mental health should exempt him from execution. In May 2024, his defense requested a comprehensive mental health study to challenge his death sentence, claiming that his psychological deterioration made him unfit for execution. However, the Nebraska courts have largely rejected these arguments, maintaining that Jenkins remains competent to face his punishment. In September 2024, he filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that crucial evidence had been mishandled and that he had received ineffective legal representation. The state of Nebraska opposed the motion, arguing that Jenkins was fully aware of his actions and had received a fair trial. Despite these rulings, Jenkins has continued his bizarre behavior behind bars. Reports from prison officials describe him as unpredictable, with frequent outbursts and self-inflicted injuries. His legal maneuvers have also extended to lawsuits against the state. In previous filings, Jenkins demanded millions in damages, claiming that Nebraska's correctional system had failed him by releasing him without adequate mental health treatment. These lawsuits were ultimately dismissed, but they highlighted Jenkins' ongoing attempts to shift blame onto the system that once housed him. His appeals process has delayed his execution date multiple times. Under Nebraska law, executions require extensive reviews and appeals before they can be carried out, and Jenkins has used every available legal avenue to prolong his time on death row. Life on death row for Nico Jenkins has been anything but ordinary. Prison officials have reported several alarming incidents involving Jenkins. In one instance, he used a makeshift weapon to slash his arms, requiring emergency medical attention. In another, he was caught attempting to mutilate his body in what he claimed was a ritual to appease Apophis. Due to his erratic behavior and history of violence, Jenkins is under constant observation. Correctional officers have noted that he often speaks in a strange, indecipherable language and has made repeated threats against prison staff and fellow inmates. His disturbing actions have made him one of the most challenging inmates in Nebraska's prison system. Security measures around Jenkins have been heightened over the years, with corrections officers taking extra precautions during his transport and interactions within the prison. His reputation for unpredictability has made him a high-risk prisoner, and authorities are constantly on alert for potential disruptions. As at the time of this video, no execution date has been set for Jenkins. However, legal experts believe it's only a matter of time before the courts reject his final appeals and move forward with his execution. The question remains, when will it happen? Today could be the day, tomorrow could be the day, or the day after. Until then, Jenkins sits in his cell, awaiting the moment when the state of Nebraska will finally decide his fate. They were killers, but their own deaths were just as brutal. Some were fried in the electric chair until their eyes burst. Others bled out as chemicals failed, and one had his head ripped clean off mid-execution. From botched lethal injections to heads rolling off the gallows, these are the craziest serial killer executions ever recorded. Alan Lee Davis. In 1982, he broke into the home of Nancy Weiler, a pregnant woman living in Jacksonville, Florida. He viciously beat her with a gun before shooting her in the face and head. Her two daughters, Christina, 9, and Catherine, 5, were not spared. Davis bound and beat them severely, causing their skulls to fracture. Christina was strangled with pantyhose, while Catherine was brutally attacked before being suffocated. The crime was so horrific that the jury took less than an hour to convict him. Davis was sentenced to death in 1983. Unlike other death row inmates, he had no interest in fighting his sentence. He spent 16 years on death row, quietly awaiting execution, but his final moments would make history for all the wrong reasons. On July 8, 1999, Alan Lee Davis was strapped into Florida's electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky. Unlike past executions, something went terribly wrong. When the first jolt of electricity hit, blood gushed from his nose, staining his white shirt completely red. His face swelled grotesquely, and his body violently convulsed. Witnesses described the scene as barbaric, with one calling it a medieval execution. The image of Davis's blood-soaked body in the chair became infamous. Photos of his corpse were later used in legal debates, leading Florida to abolish the electric chair. At 7:15 a.m., Alan Lee Davis was pronounced dead, but his execution remains one of the most gruesome in modern history. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man, was one of the most disturbing serial killers in history. Born in 1870, his childhood was filled with abuse, neglect, and an early fascination with pain. As he grew older, his desires became more grotesque. He engaged in self-mutilation, developed a taste for cannibalism, and targeted the most vulnerable victims, children. Between 1924 and 1928, Fish kidnapped, tortured, and murdered multiple young victims. He often sought out children from low-income or marginalized communities, believing their disappearances would attract less attention. His crimes were unimaginably brutal, involving mutilation, sadism, and cannibalism. One of his most infamous victims was 10-year-old Grace Budd. In 1928, Fish lured her from her family's home under the pretense of taking her to a birthday party. Instead, he took her to an abandoned house, where he tortured, strangled, dismembered, and ate parts of her body. In a disturbing twist, years later, Fish sent a letter to Grace's parents, describing in detail how he had murdered and eaten their child. This sick confession ultimately led to his arrest in 1934. Fish's trial in 1935 was one of the most shocking in American history. His crimes were so gruesome that even seasoned detectives were horrified. He claimed he was following God's orders when he killed children, attempting to use an insanity defense. Despite his horrifying claims, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Though some believed he was insane, they wanted him dead. He was sentenced to death by electrocution at Sing Sing Prison. On the night of January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was led to the electric chair. Even as he walked toward his death, he remained calm. When asked if he had any last words, he responded eerily, "I don't even know why I'm here." At 11:06 p.m., the switch was flipped. Thousands of volts surged through his body, causing his frail frame to shake violently. But due to his body being filled with metal needles, which he had inserted himself as part of his sadistic pleasures, the first jolt was not enough. Witnesses watched in horror as Fish remained alive after the first shock. The executioners had to administer a second surge of electricity, finally killing him. 3 minutes later, Albert Fish was dead. Justice had been served for the lives he had destroyed. John Wayne Gacy. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy preyed on young men and teenage boys, tricking them into coming to his house in Des Plaines, Illinois. He promised them work or money, but once they were inside, he turned into a monster. He would trap them with handcuffs or rope, torture them, and strangle them to death. His sick rope trick was a twisted game. He would tighten the rope around their necks while taunting them, saying, "This is the last trick." To the outside world, Gacy was a successful businessman and a friendly neighbor. Born in 1942, he had a rough childhood, growing up with an abusive father who constantly put him down. As an adult, he built a fake image of himself. He ran a construction company, got involved in local politics, and even performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. But behind closed doors, he was hiding a horrible secret. He was a serial killer. Gacy buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were dumped in nearby rivers. In December 1978, authorities arrested him after investigating the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest. A search of his home uncovered horrifying evidence: human remains, bloody clothing, and personal items belonging to missing young men. Gacy's trial in 1980 was one of the most disturbing in U.S. history. The evidence was overwhelming. He had killed at least 33 people. His defense attempted an insanity plea, but the jury saw through it. After just 2 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty of all charges. On March 13, 1980, he was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row, appealing his sentence, but nothing could save him. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was scheduled to die by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. The execution drew widespread attention. Witnesses included journalists and family members of his victims. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some holding signs that read, "No tears for the clown." For his last meal, Gacy requested a bucket of fried chicken, French fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke, a seemingly ordinary choice for a man who had committed unspeakable horrors. At 12:01 a.m., he was strapped to a gurney, IVs inserted into his arm. When asked for final words, he smirked and muttered, "Kiss my ass." But what was supposed to be a swift execution turned into a gruesome disaster. The chemicals used in the lethal injection solidified, clogging the IV tubes. Gacy remained alive, his body convulsing for 18 minutes while officials scrambled to fix the issue. The delay was horrifying, yet fitting for a man who had inflicted so much suffering. At 12:58 a.m., the process was completed. John Wayne Gacy was finally dead. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Throughout the 1970s, he stalked, kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered young women across multiple states. His method was disturbing. He would often feign injury, pretending to need help, or pose as a police officer to lure victims into his car. Once isolated, his true sadistic nature emerged. He would brutally assault, strangle, or bludgeon his victims, often revisiting their corpses to commit unspeakable acts of necrophilia. Though Bundy's crimes spanned years, he evaded arrest through sheer cunning, escaping from custody twice. But in February 1978, after murdering 2 women at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house and abducting 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his luck ran out. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Bundy's trial became a nationwide spectacle, the first to be televised in U.S. history. He relished the media attention, using his charm and intelligence to manipulate those around him. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he attempted to represent himself in court, turning the proceedings into a bizarre show of narcissism. In July 1979, he was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. A year later, he was convicted again for the murder of Kimberly Leach, receiving another death sentence. After years of delaying tactics and last-minute appeals, Bundy finally ran out of options. The execution was set for January the 24th, 1989. Bundy spent his last night in Florida State Prison's death row wing, meeting with a minister and psychologist. He had abandoned his usual arrogance, now desperately pleading for a stay of execution. He even confessed to additional murders, hoping that cooperation would buy him time. But it was too late. The families of his victims and the public demanded justice. His last meal request was simple: steak, eggs, toast, hash browns, and coffee. Unlike most condemned men, he barely touched it. As dawn broke on January 24th, Bundy was led from his cell to the execution chamber. The atmosphere outside the prison was surreal. Hundreds of people gathered, chanting, cheering, and even setting off fireworks in celebration. Inside, Bundy was strapped into the electric chair, his head and legs secured. A black leather mask covered his face. Witnesses, including law enforcement and victims' families, looked on as the final moments unfolded. When asked for last words, Bundy's response was uncharacteristically subdued. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The switch was thrown. Thousands of volts surged through his body. His fists clenched, His body stiffened and smoke curled from beneath the mask. After 2 full jolts, Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Peter Kürten. The crimes of Peter Kürten were nothing short of monstrous. Between February and November of 1929, he unleashed a wave of terror across Dusseldorf, brutally murdering and assaulting men, women, and children. His methods were horrifying. He used hammers, scissors, and knives, leaving victims mutilated beyond recognition. But the most chilling aspect of his crimes was his fascination with blood. Kürten claimed he drank from the wounds of some victims, earning him the nickname the Vampire of Dusseldorf. His reign of terror ended in May 1930, when one of his surviving victims helped police track him down. Once in custody, he showed no remorse, confessing in gruesome detail to each murder. His trial in April 1931 captivated Germany with testimonies that painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. He admitted to 79 crimes, including 9 murders and multiple assaults, but his cold and matter-of-fact demeanor in court left everyone horrified. The jury wasted no time. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by beheading. Kürten spent over a year awaiting execution at Cologne-Klingelputz prison. Unlike other condemned men, he did not fear death. In fact, he seemed to welcome it, speaking often about his fascination with decapitation. Prison officials noted his unsettling calm, as if he was anticipating something more than just an end. On the morning of July 2, 1931, the time had come. Guards led him to the guillotine, where a priest and psychiatrist stood waiting. He displayed no emotion, walking steadily to the wooden platform. Then, just before kneeling before the deadly blade, he turned to the psychiatrist with an eerie question. "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure, to end all pleasures." The room fell silent. There was no fear in his voice, only a morbid curiosity. The executioner gave the signal, and in one swift motion, the blade fell, severing his head instantly. For a brief moment, witnesses swore. His lips moved as if trying to speak, his eyes blinking rapidly before the life drained from them. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. From the very beginning, her life was filled with hardship and suffering. Abandoned by her mother and raised by abusive grandparents, Wuornos endured horrific sexual abuse as a child. By her teenage years, she was homeless, surviving through prostitution and petty crimes. Her killing spree began in 1989, targeting men she met while working as a sex worker along Florida highways. Over the course of a year, she murdered 7 men, each found shot multiple times. Wuornos claimed that she acted in self-defense, alleging that her victims had attempted to rape her. However, the nature of the killings, multiple gunshots, robbery, and the disposal of bodies suggested something far more calculated. On January 9, 1991, Wuornos was arrested at a bar in Florida after a nationwide manhunt. When confronted with overwhelming evidence, including items stolen from her victims, she confessed to the murders. Her trial was swift. Wuornos was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder. She initially defended her actions as self-defense, but later admitted that she killed purely for financial gain. In 1992, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. While on death row, Wuornos' mental health rapidly deteriorated. She claimed the prison guards were abusing her, subjecting her to sonic pressure and attempting to make her insane. She refused further appeals, stating, "I'd kill again." On October 9, 2002, she was scheduled for execution. Unlike most death row inmates, she declined a last meal, choosing instead a single cup of coffee. Wuornos was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber of Florida State Prison. The room was filled with witnesses, including media members and family representatives of her victims. Before the lethal injection was administered, she delivered one of the strangest final statements in execution history. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with The Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back." At 9:47 a.m., the drugs entered her system. Within minutes, she was pronounced dead. Tom Ketchum. Ketchum was an infamous outlaw of the Wild West, known for train robberies, gunfights, and violence. Born in 1863, he spent most of his life as a cattle rancher before turning to a life of crime. By the 1890s, Ketchum had joined a notorious band of outlaws that terrorized New Mexico and Texas. His crimes escalated when he and his gang began robbing trains, often using dynamite to blow open safes. He was ruthless. Those who got in his way often ended up dead. But his luck ran out in 1899 when he attempted a solo train robbery near Folsom, New Mexico. Shot by the conductor, he fled on horseback but collapsed from blood loss. Authorities captured him soon after. Ketchum was put on trial in Clayton, New Mexico, and sentenced to death by hanging, a rare punishment for train robbery. But because no one in town had ever hanged a man before, his execution would turn into one of the most gruesome in American history. On April 26, 1901, Tom Ketchum was led to the gallows in Clayton, New Mexico. A massive crowd gathered, eager to witness his hanging. The executioners miscalculated the rope length, failing to adjust it properly for his weight. When the trap door opened, Ketchum dropped, but instead of his neck breaking, his head was completely ripped from his body. His headless corpse sat upright for several seconds before slumping over, horrifying witnesses. Blood gushed from the stump, soaking the execution platform. His severed head rolled across the ground, landing near the feet of the onlookers. The sight was so grotesque that some people fainted. Gary Gilmore. Gary Mark Gilmore's crimes weren't those of a sadistic serial killer, but they were no less senseless. Born in Texas in 1940, he grew up in a turbulent household, struggling with feelings of neglect. By the time he reached adulthood, his life was defined by crime, violence, and an inability to stay out of prison. But it wasn't until July 1976 that his actions would lead him to the death chamber. On the night of July 19, 1976 in Orem, Utah, Gilmore walked into a gas station where 24-year-old attendant Max Jensen was working alone. Jensen complied with Gilmore's demands for money, but instead of leaving, Gilmore shot him in the head at point-blank range, killing him instantly. The murder was entirely unnecessary. Jensen had done everything Gilmore asked. Just 4 days later, on July 23rd, he struck again. This time, his victim was 26-year-old Benny Bushnell, the night manager of a motel in Provo, Utah. As with Jensen, Bushnell handed over the cash, but Gilmore executed him anyway. Police quickly linked the murders, and within days, Gilmore was arrested. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he made no effort to deny his actions. Gilmore's trial began in October 1976, and it was one of the shortest capital cases in modern history. The jury took only 2 days to find him guilty of both murders. The prosecution pushed for the death penalty, and on October 7, 1976, the court sentenced him to death. What made Gilmore's case unique was his reaction. He did not fight the sentence. Instead, he insisted that he be executed as soon as possible. At a time when the death penalty had been suspended for nearly a decade in the U.S., his case became a legal and political battleground. Civil rights organizations fought to prevent his execution, arguing that capital punishment violated constitutional rights, but Gilmore refused all appeals. He rejected any attempt to spare his life, and even threatened suicide when delays arose. Utah still had 2 execution methods at the time, hanging and firing squad. Gilmore chose the firing squad, saying simply, "I'd rather be shot." At sunrise on January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore was led into the execution chamber at Utah State Prison. The room was dimly lit, with a single wooden chair placed in the center. 5 gunmen, local police officers, stood concealed behind a curtain, rifles aimed through small openings in the wall. One of their rifles was loaded with a blank, so that no one would know who fired the fatal shot. As Gilmore was secured to the chair, the prison chaplain, Father Thomas Mearsman, stood nearby to administer last rites. Gilmore's last words, spoken with eerie calm, were, "Let's do it." With his head covered by a black hood, he whispered in Latin, "Dominus vobiscum," "The Lord be with you." Father Mearsman responded, "Et cum spiritu tuo," and with your spirit. A moment later, the order was given. The sound of 5 simultaneous gunshots echoed through the chamber as the bullets struck their target, a small white cloth pinned over his heart. Within seconds, Gary Gilmore was dead. His execution was the first in the United States after a 10-year moratorium, marking the return of the death penalty. David Mason. David Edwin Mason was born on December 2, 1956 in Georgia, but his crimes took place in California. Raised in an abusive household, Mason's violent tendencies emerged early. By 1980, he had embarked on a brutal killing spree, preying on elderly victims. Between March and December of 1980, Mason strangled, beat, and robbed 5 elderly individuals. His victims, including 73-year-old Joan Picard and 83-year-old Arthur Jennings, were targeted in their homes, making his crimes particularly shocking. His final known victim was Antoinette Brown, a 75-year-old woman whom he brutally beat and strangled using makeshift knots. Mason was arrested on January 15, 1981. A search of his residence uncovered stolen valuables, blood-stained clothing, and a disturbing cassette recording of him discussing the murders. In 1984, he was convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to death. Unlike most condemned prisoners, Mason refused to file appeals, stating that he accepted his fate. As Mason's execution date approached, he refused all appeals, even when his attorneys attempted to stop the execution on his behalf. He declined a special last meal, choosing to eat the same food as other inmates. His only request? A glass of ice water. On August 24, 1993, at San Quentin State Prison, Mason was led into the gas chamber. He was given the opportunity to stop the execution by blinking twice, signaling a change of mind. He refused. When the warden asked for his final decision, Mason calmly replied, "No, warden, I want to proceed. Thank you, warden." At 12:23 a.m., cyanide gas filled the chamber. Witnesses watched as Mason gasped, convulsed, and ultimately succumbed. Within 3 minutes, he was dead. David Mason's execution was the last time California used the gas chamber. Amelia Dyer. Born in 1836, Amelia Dyer's early years were shaped by hardship. She trained as a nurse, but financial struggles led her to the grim world of baby farming, a Victorian-era practice where women took in unwanted infants for a fee, often under the pretense of offering them care. At first, Dyer may have genuinely tried to provide for these children, but greed soon overtook morality. Rather than raise or rehome them, she began murdering the infants to keep the payments without the burden of care. Strangulation became her preferred method, ensuring no child survived long in her hands. She disposed of their tiny bodies in rivers, buried them in shallow graves, or simply abandoned them in the streets. For years, Dyer evaded detection by frequently changing locations, but in 1896, her crimes caught up with her. The body of an infant was discovered floating in the River Thames. A closer inspection revealed a piece of paper wrapped with the body, bearing Amelia Dyer's address. Police launched an immediate investigation. When they raided her home, they found horrifying evidence: baby clothes, adoption papers, and letters from desperate mothers who had unknowingly handed their infants over to a murderer. Authorities believed she had killed over 400 infants, making her one of the deadliest female killers in history. Dyer was arrested and put on trial in May 1896. Despite her attempts to plead insanity, the overwhelming evidence against her sealed her fate. The jury took only 4.5 minutes to convict her. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. On the morning of June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was led to the gallows at Newgate Prison. Unlike some condemned prisoners, she showed no emotion, walking with eerie calm toward the noose. A priest stood beside her, offering her final rites. When asked for any last words, she spoke just 3 chilling words: "I have nothing." The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Moments later, the trapdoor beneath her feet swung open and she dropped. Death was instantaneous.